Okay, I know the title and the admittedly clickbait thumbnail make me look a certain kind of way, but let me be clear that I am a massive fan of Mushoku Tensei. It does a lot of things very right, and it's one of my favorite pieces of media to consume multiple times because you end up noticing more and more with each pass. And just to preemptively answer your questions, I'm only going to be showing still frames from the anime because if I show the actual video, Kadokawa's legal department will send someone to the US to stab me in the liver. Also, you'll notice a timestamp in the corner of those stills because I was doing a live stream, having the timestamp visible was relevant, and I fully deleted the unedited versions before I knew I was going to be making this video. So I'm working with what I got. Sounds good? Good. So the thing about me is I started out with the light novels, fully finishing the main series and making a few videos on it before only just recently starting the anime, which I'm analyzing live on YouTube, Twitch, and Kick every Sunday at 9 AM Eastern. Okay. And I will say, I don't know why, but I see this character right here. I don't know, I can almost kind of understand the furries when I see her. One thing I learned is when it comes to media with any amount of edginess or sexuality, there's always going to be an initial hurdle to get over before you can appreciate it for what it is, and some people just can't do that. And I typically don't engage with these people because I know they are incapable of coming to the table in good faith, and that's just how it is. So when I would see people say, oh, I'd love Mushoku Tensei if Rudy wasn't such a, can't say the word this early in the video, so connoisseur of the underage, I figure it was just another example of that. Because when you actually read the books, it becomes very clear very early on that Rudy's issue is that he's a completely broken man that has no understanding of social norms due to 2 decades of isolation, and a completely warped perception on sexuality due to sexual trauma and the constant use of porn for escapism. It was obvious to me that early Rudy viewed the world through a sexual lens, and when he grew to care about someone, it would manifest a desire. And when he would cross lines, it was because he couldn't even comprehend why what he was doing was bad until he crosses a line that upsets someone he cares about, at which point he learns and grows. And as he matures, heals, and overcomes yet another instance of sexual trauma, he stops having inappropriate sexual desires entirely. So I assume the issue was one of closed-minded idiots who can't accept a flawed hero. But then I also noticed similar takes from people who generally are more open-minded, and that threw me for a loop a bit. But after watching the first 8 episodes for myself, which is the equivalent to the first 2 volumes of the light novels and where Rudy was undoubtedly at his worst, I think I kinda get it. While I maintain that if you can get over that hurdle, you can appreciate Rudy as a complex character and understand why he is the way he is, that hurdle is much larger in the anime than in the books. And that comes down to one simple factor. In the anime, it's less clear that Rudy's behavior is a response to trauma and seclusion than it is in the books. And why is that? Well, there are a couple different things contributing to this issue, but I think the biggest factor is this. Rudy is a complex character with complex issues that completely warp his perception of basically everything, and it takes a very long time to meaningfully overcome that. There's a lot going on, and the way the light novels are written is that the majority of that is Rudy telling the story in first person, and it's done beat by beat, thought by thought, stream of consciousness style. While there are some chapters that switch to a different perspective, such as another character, an omniscient narrator, and even a future historian, the majority of the time is spent in Rudy's head. We see things how he sees things, we know what he thinks. We are basically sharing Rudy's point of view. But the anime doesn't do that, and it's not even its fault. A visual medium such as TV simply can't do that to the same degree as a book. While the light novels place the reader directly in Rudy's head, the anime puts the viewer off to the side so they can watch the story from there. So the light novels will have Rudy do something inappropriate alongside all the various thoughts and emotions broiling inside him for context. And while you're never meant to support those actions, you understand how someone who is genuinely not a malicious person can get to a place where they're capable of doing these things. With the anime, a lot of that context is implied or is done through visual and audio storytelling, which is not always as easy to pick up on. Especially if you're the type of person who prefers to experience fiction from the surface level rather than autistically digging into it like I do. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about by discussing how both versions of Mushoku Tensei handle the infamous bath scene from Volume 1 of the light novels and Season 1, Episode 3 of the anime. Here's the relevant information that applies to both depictions. At this point, Rudy is 6 years old and he started to develop a close friendship with Sylphie, having been initially drawn to her because she was a victim of bullying, which he has a strong emotional reaction to due to his experiences in his past life. Notably, Rudy is still under the mistaken impression that Sylphie is a boy. The two get caught in a rainstorm while practicing magic, and Rudy took her back to his family's home because rain. A bath was prepped, Rudy strips down, Sylphie is uncomfortable and refuses, and Rudy ends up pulling down her underwear by surprise, because he figures she needs to get out of her wet clothes so she doesn't catch a cold. He realizes both that she's a girl and that he fucked up, and that's all that matters for now. So here's how the light novel depicts the immediate aftermath and Rudy's initial reaction. Sylph shrieked. A moment later, he squatted and curled up into himself to hide his body from sight. But in that moment, what flashed before my eyes was not the pure short sword to which I had grown recently accustomed, nor naturally was it a dark blade bearing ominous sigils. No, what was there, rather, what wasn't there, was, well, replaced by something that shouldn't have been there. It was something I'd seen many times over in my past life, on my computer monitor. Sometimes it was covered with a pixelated mosaic, other times it was uncensored. I'd stare, thinking about how much I wanted to lick and be inside the real thing someday, my dark lust inevitably causing my white cannon to hit the mark on a handful of tissues. One of those. That's what Sylph had. He was a she. My vision went white. What I'd just done was not okay at all. Rudeus, what are you doing? I came to my senses to see Paul standing there. When had he gotten home? Had he come into the room because he'd heard Sylph cry out? I stood petrified. Paul did likewise. There was Sylph, hunched and curled up, naked and sobbing. There I was, also naked, with her underpants clutched in my hand. There was no talking my way out of this one. It was raining just outside, but it sounded so very far away. That passage can be roughly broken down into 3 component parts. The first is Rudy being caught off guard by the fact that Sylphie did not have a penis, and this is lightly comedic, utilizing his Gooner brain thought processes in a way that readers will have been well accustomed to by that point. At this point in his life, this is just how he tends to mentally engage with the world around him, harkening back to his 20 years of isolation and suppressing his emotional pain by jerking off. But after 2 paragraphs, the jokes stop completely, and there are just a few short lines explicitly explaining the situation, which can be summed up as, "Oh fuck, she's a girl and I just did something very, very wrong." And I think that's important. A direct admission with no ambiguity that he knows that he was in the moral wrong. The last segment is Paul breaking Rudy's initial shock, at which point he realizes both how bad the situation is and how bad it looks, and retreats inward, tunnel visioning on his negative emotions, as shown by him mentally blocking out the sound of the storm that was still raging. So that was how the light novel handled things, before it moves on to Paul giving Rudy a father-son talk about boundaries and consent. Pretty straightforward, and while there were plenty of little narrative devices in there wasn't really anything left up to the reader's interpretation. It's very clear as to what Rudy is thinking in this moment. So for the anime, here's how it goes. Rudy pulls down Sylphie's underwear, and just for a second, both of them freeze and the music cuts out, and you can see a shot of Rudy's stunned face before Sylphie breaks down in tears. In his mind, Rudy goes on to narrate what I've described as the first section of the light novel passage. The wording is different, but it hits all the same beats. However, it does not repeat the full passage, instead ending at "he was a she." Rather than Rudy telling us his thoughts, they're shown through non-verbal storytelling. First, there's an extreme close-up of Rudy's face that pans to the left, showing Sylphie's sobbing face reflected in both of his eyes. Then Paul's interruption happens while this narration continues, as opposed to after, like the light novel. However, his voice is muted and fading, as are Sylphie's cries and every sound aside from the narration as the camera slowly zooms out. Then it cuts back to Rudy's face and he says that last line, "He was a she," followed by a thunderclap and a flash of lightning. So I think most of you watching right now could watch that scene and immediately understand what it's going for, even if you don't really have a particularly deep understanding of writing or filmmaking or any of the technical aspects that go into telling a story. But to really frame my argument moving forward, let's look at what exactly it's doing and how that differs from the light novel. If we go back to my breakdown of the light novel passage, remember that it has 3 rough parts: the initial processing, the realization, and the descent into negativity. All 3 of these things are put forth very explicitly. Even if you're 100% passively consuming, not reading into anything, or even if your English language skills just aren't at the level where you can pick up on many subtleties. No shade if that's you, by the way. They don't really teach these things in school, and it's even harder if it's not your native language. But even without that level of proficiency, it's very hard to misinterpret the message because it's spelled out for you. Rudy's thoughts and feelings are given to you in a very direct manner. Contrast this with the anime, ignoring for a moment the fact that the non-verbal techniques it's using are, in my opinion, very overt. The first section of the passage is reflected pretty much one-to-one. The wording is different, but the core point of Rudy processing things with his otaku Gooner brain is directly laid out in the narration. The second segment is there partially. The line, "he was a she," is lifted directly, so the realization that Sylphie is a girl is made explicit, even though it would have been obvious even if it was left unsaid. However, the other half of Rudy's realization that he just seriously fucked up is done through the visuals. Specifically, the initial shocked look on his face to represent the "oh fuck" moment, followed by Sylphie's sobs reflected in his eyes, showing that all he can think about is that this person he deeply cares for is hurting and that it's his fault. Once again, this is not hard for a viewer to understand even if they can't really break it down into words like I'm doing here. I'm not trying to say that this is some hidden thing that you need big brain to take away. What I'm trying to highlight is that this part of the story is not told with words, but is shown, and the viewer is meant to interpret and understand on an emotional level. And while the light novel is also trying to get the reader to have these same emotional resonance, that's done in addition to the fact that it directly puts the information on the page. The third segment in the light novel is slightly less explicit, but still contains more direct information than the anime. While Rudy's tunnel vision is largely implied, and granted the implication is very obvious given that he says the nearby rainstorm sounds far away and rain itself is often used to represent negative emotions in writing, we do get a direct explanation that Rudy realizes just how bad it looks. In context, the line, "there was no talking my way out of this one," is designed to highlight the contrast between this scene and the previous chapter where Rudy won a big argument with Paul because he was in the right. And of course, in this scene there's a confrontation where Rudy is very obviously in the wrong. And this is going to be more obvious to the average reader than how I'm probably making it seem, but remember that this is fresh in the reader's mind. Like, it just happened and it was a big deal. But since the anime's narration doesn't include this third segment of the passage, focusing primarily on the tunnel vision, and again this is done through audiovisual storytelling as opposed to actual words, the slow zoom creates distance between the scene and the audience, and the audio fade for everything that isn't the narration, which itself is basically meant to be Rudy's thoughts, shows that Rudy is completely overwhelmed and laser focused on his own thoughts to the exclusion of the outside world. The contrast between this scene and the previous fight with Paul is not directly referenced, but in this instance it's also going to be very fresh in the viewer's mind because it happened like 5 minutes prior in the same episode. So again, they just saw it go down. And then it's closed off with a thunderclap, which is a near universal literary method of accenting something dramatic or serious. So where's this all going? Isn't this all pretty obvious even if you're just a casual viewer? Well, yes, and that's kind of the point. I chose this scene in particular because it's very memorable, but also because it's easy to see the things I'm talking about without really needing any previous experience with media analysis. I wanted to highlight a key idea, which is that the light novels go into more explicit, direct details about how Rudy processes the things he experiences, and the nuance comes more from the fact that he's a somewhat unreliable narrator who explains things according to his perspective, which is often skewed. The anime, however, takes much of that direct information and conveys it in ways that simply aren't available in pure text, such as color, music, camera work, animation, facial expressions, timing, all completely effective in my opinion, but all things that force the viewer to do at least a little bit of the work themselves to pick up what it's putting down. If we imagine this same bath scene from an oblivious person's perspective, someone who just can't see anything beyond the surface level, they'll only see the well-established perv Rudy pull down Sylphie's underwear and freeze in shock before overtly acknowledging that she's actually a girl, and conclude that he's just a creep who sexually harassed a child because he felt like it, and he was only caught off guard because he thought she was a boy. Now, even someone who doesn't like Mushoku Tensei would likely realize that this is a very unfair representation of things. But remember that I chose this scene specifically because the underlying message was something I could easily explain, even to people who are completely unfamiliar with Mushoku Tensei. Mushoku Tensei is more than just the bath scene, and the light novels spend a lot more than 3 paragraphs going over Rudy's thoughts. The general concept I'm highlighting here is a microcosm of the wider experience of this series. Many of Rudy's other inappropriate actions are a lot harder to contextualize without the direct knowledge from the text, like his obsession with Roxy or groping Eris, or any number of other Rudyisms. And it's not helped that many of these instances of strange thoughts and behaviors naturally lose a lot of the nuance without that explicit context behind them. These moments are funny because of how out of pocket they are, but the light novels will often hide deeper character work behind these outrageous things. And that often does require a bit of digging to uncover, even with the direct information the reader receives. As a quick example, both versions of Mushoku Tensei have a line where Rudy remembers a childhood friend from his past life and mentions that he can get off to the related hentai tags in 3 pumps. In both cases, he takes a thought that should not be sexual and then immediately pivots to, oh yeah, porn. And the absurdity of that makes it funny. But in the light novel, this line comes in the prologue of Volume 1 as Rudy is kicked out of his home and stewing on his regrets. One of those regrets is having lost contact with this childhood friend. One thing that's not explicitly stated, but easy enough to figure out if you actively think about it, is that during Rudy's 20 years of isolation, it's very likely that the only thing resembling happiness that he ever felt was sexual pleasure from all the hentai he consumed. As a result, he really can't comprehend positive feelings that aren't sexual in some way, which is why he not only tends to lust after the people he cares about early on, but when you look back at the 3 pumps line with that additional context, you can see that his unhealthy mental state has twisted the happy thoughts he had about his old friend into desire, and what should be bittersweet nostalgia becomes something he can jack off to. Especially when this happens in the middle of a self-defeating soliloquy in a scene that's very much not comedic except for this and one other funny line that also does a lot of the same kind of thing. Again, it sounds bad at first, but there's more to it when you peel the layers away. The anime puts this line further out when Rudy has made friends with Sylphie, which makes him remember his old childhood friend, at which point the narration humorously concludes the thought with the 3 pumps line. In that case, it really is mostly just for comedic effect. You don't really get the full emotional breadth of that line because as an observer of Rudy, rather than someone experiencing things with him, you don't really see just how much sex overpowers his entire perspective, and while funny, it often just comes off as creepy rather than the reality that it's more sad than anything. This kind of thing is prevalent throughout at least the early parts of the story, where Rudy is still learning very basic lessons like stop when someone says no and hands to myself. A lot of his behavior is genuinely really bad, but without the full picture, it's a bit harder to pick up on the reality that while he's acting in the way a malicious person might, he's not actually malicious at all, just completely emotionally broken. And ultimately, it takes him overcoming another sexual trauma through a healthy sexual experience with a loving and accepting partner to really heal that. It's just not as clear in the anime that Rudy is actually a good person at his core because it just doesn't spend as much time in his head. And since he's at his absolute worst early on, it turns a lot of people away before his nobler qualities start to shine. Now granted, I still think that an anime only can still pick up on all this stuff and have a solid grasp of Rudy as a character without too much difficulty. I mean, that should be fairly obvious given how popular the anime has become, even among people who have never read the books. But I can also see how someone can come to Mushoku Tensei in good faith and be like, fuck this, Rudy's just a disgusting pedo. It's not that they're necessarily closed-minded, it just takes a bit of extra insight that might be difficult for some to overcome with that initial aversion to Rudy's behavior. And I'm coming from the perspective of probably having a more open mind than most due to how often I engage with media that's less conventionally accepted. I mean, one of the things I'm known for is reviewing the rants games, which are pornographic and feature a protagonist who's a comedic rapist. So I've conditioned myself to not judge the surface level, but most average people don't have that kind of experience. And while I do certainly think it's a shame that so many people just dismiss Mushoku Tensei due to their initial impression, I can't really hate them for it if they basically just say it's not for me and don't act like assholes about it. I do think they're wrong, but it's hard to blame them when you really think about it. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. I assumed that most, if not all of the Mushoku Tensei detractors were just closed-minded morons who decided to hate on the premise alone. Now don't get me wrong, those type of people absolutely exist. Just look at the comments on my Euphoria video if you want some examples. But upon starting the Mushoku Tensei anime, I definitely understand the detractors a bit more despite vehemently disagreeing with them. And you know what? I'm better off because of it. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my channel members, especially my $10 members Bulk Squat Thrust and President Irina Vladimirovna Putina. All members got to see this video early, so if that interests you, you can click the join button below for as little as $1 a month. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more, and check out the stream 9 AM Sunday for a live analysis of the Mushoku Tensei anime. It'll be on this channel and also Twitch and Kick. Well, once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Play the Electro Swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no